In the midst of the Crusades, when the Holy Land was the scene of bloody disputes between Christians and Muslims, a unique figure emerged, marked by both courage and tragedy: Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the young leper king. Among the many episodes that defined his brief and intense career, one dramatic moment stands out: the Siege of Le Chastellet in 1179. This fortress, built at a strategic point on the banks of the Jordan River, was intended to be a Christian stronghold against Muslim incursions. However, its daring construction was also a direct provocation to Saladin, the charismatic Sultan of Egypt and Syria. In this video, we will delve into the history of a brutal siege of an unassailable castle that dared to defy the military logic of the time and paid a terrible price for it. Watch until the end to find out how the young Baldwin faced the consequences of this decision, revealing his political astuteness, his determination in the face of illness, and his complex relationship with the lords of the kingdom. Get ready to relive one of the most intense and symbolic battles of Baldwin's reign, where stone, blood, and faith came together in a decisive confrontation. In the 12th century, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile political entity, born of the First Crusade and sustained by fragile alliances and well-positioned castles. Surrounded by growing Muslim powers, the kingdom was constantly pressured by external enemies and internal disputes. After Saladin's rise as Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the threat intensified considerably. The Latin Christians, though fearless, were constantly at a numerical and strategic disadvantage. In this tense environment, Baldwin, young and marked by leprosy, ruled with surprising energy, facing the military and political challenges of his time with a determination that impressed his allies and terrified his enemies. In the middle of the year 1179, the construction of a new fortress began to unsettle strategists in the Islamic world. It was Le Chastellet, also known as Jacob's Ford Castle, a vital point on the Jordan River that served as a natural passage between Galilee and Damascus. The decision to build a Christian castle there came from King Baldwin, who, even though weakened by leprosy, saw in that position an opportunity to contain the Muslim advance to the west and at the same time openly challenge Saladin's growing authority in Syria. The fortress project was ambitious, built with the support of the Knights Templar and financed with resources from the Latin Kingdom and European donors. Le Chastellet was erected with impressive speed. Its walls, reinforced by stone towers and bastions, were considered almost impregnable. Saladin himself, upon learning of the work in progress, was reportedly alarmed by the fortress's location. It was only a day's journey from Damascus, directly threatening his supply and communication routes. It did not take long for the Muslim Sultan to act. Saladin initially tried to avoid direct confrontation. Contemporary sources, such as the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, report that he offered large sums of gold for Baldwin to abandon the construction. The young king refused. The decision was met with admiration by some and concern by others within the Royal Council of Jerusalem itself. Many knew that provoking Saladin without full preparation could be disastrous. Still, Baldwin stood firm. It was a moment of political and spiritual affirmation. To retreat would be to cede ground, literally and symbolically, to an enemy growing in prestige. The construction of Le Chastellet was therefore more than a military move. It was an affirmation of Christian permanence in the Holy Land, a gesture of resistance in the face of the rising tide of Islam, reunified under Saladin's leadership. In August 1179, even before the fortress was completely finished, Saladin's troops advanced on the site. It is estimated that the Muslim army numbered more than 10,000 men, including archers, Turkish horsemen, and siege engines. Le Chastellet, although unfinished, was garrisoned by about 1,000 knights and soldiers, among them many Templars, known for their rigidity and courage in the face of the enemy. The siege was brutal. For almost 5 days, Muslim forces bombarded the walls with catapults and battering rams, digging mines to collapse the supporting bases. The defenders resisted tenaciously. William of Tyre recounts that the defenders of Le Chastellet fought with the fervor of martyrs, as if the very future of the kingdom were at stake. From atop the walls, a rain of arrows and boiling oil fell on the besiegers. But Saladin, determined and ruthless, ordered constant attacks, day and night. On the 5th day, a section of the foundations gave way. The walls were breached, and Saladin's soldiers invaded the fortress. What followed was a massacre. The defenders who did not die in the fighting were captured. Among the Templars, few were spared. The chronicles differ on the exact number, but it is agreed that hundreds of Christian knights were executed after the fall of the fortress, a warning from Saladin to all who dared to challenge his authority. News of the fall of Le Chastellet spread quickly throughout the kingdom. Baldwin, who had assembled a relief army, arrived too late. The defeat was a profound blow, not only because of the number of dead or the strategic loss, but because of the symbolism of the fall. Le Chastellet was supposed to be an indomitable fortress, proof of the Christians' ability to maintain their presence in the Holy Land. Its destruction exposed the kingdom's limitations and revealed the disciplined strength of Saladin's army. However, it is important to note that the fall of the fortress did not mean Baldwin's surrender. On the contrary, the king reinforced other defensive positions, reorganized his forces, and continued to resist vigorously. The episode served as a painful warning. The war against Saladin would be long, complex, and require more than faith and bravery. It would require strategy, unity, and above all, a realism that was beginning to be lacking among the Crusader leaders. The Siege of Le Chastellet thus became a turning point, a clear demonstration of what was to come. The Holy Land was about to plunge into a new cycle of conflict, and Baldwin, even though ravaged by leprosy, would remain at the center of this turmoil until his last breath. The loss of Le Chastellet, devastating as it was, did not mean the collapse of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, demonstrating remarkable composure in the face of tragedy, knew how to learn lessons from the episode. The king, only 18 at the time, already bore the advanced signs of leprosy in his bones, but his mind remained as sharp as a knight's blade. Instead of falling into despair, he summoned the Haute Cour, the council of nobles of the kingdom, and began a thorough reassessment of the defensive strategy. The first measure was to reinforce the existing castles in Galilee and other vulnerable regions, especially those guarding the road between Jerusalem and the northern border. At the same time, Baldwin sought to forge closer ties with military orders such as the Templars and the Hospitallers, recognizing that, given the numerical superiority of the Muslims, the survival of the kingdom depended on the discipline and religious fanaticism of these specialized forces. But the real battlefield became another, the diplomatic one. The Siege of Le Chastellet had repercussions not only in the Holy Land, but also in Europe. The destruction of the fortress was perceived as a warning that Saladin had become a real and immediate threat to the survival of the Crusader kingdoms. Baldwin took advantage of the commotion to send messengers to Rome and to the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, begging for reinforcements. Reports of the fall of Le Chastellet were accompanied by emotional appeals, highlighting the martyrdom of Christian knights and the ruthlessness of the enemy. At the same time, Saladin understood that the destruction of the fortress did not mean the end of Christian resistance. He viewed Baldwin with a curious mixture of contempt and respect. According to Muslim chroniclers, the Sultan commented that young man, though marked by death, has the heart of a lion and the gaze of a hawk. The image of the leper king, leading his men with determination, even as his flesh was consumed, was impressive to both allies and enemies alike. Internally, however, the siege had revealed dangerous cracks. Some nobles of the kingdom began to question the young monarch's authority, accusing him of provoking Saladin unnecessarily with the construction of Le Chastellet. Among these critics was the ambitious Raymond III of Tripoli, who began to plot alternative alliances, perhaps aiming for a regency, perhaps even the throne. Baldwin, aware of these movements, began to surround himself with loyal advisors and consolidate his personal power despite his growing illness. Another key element was the role of the Templars. The order, hard hit by the loss of the fortress and the execution of so many of its brothers, reacted with a redoubled spirit of revenge. Under the leadership of men such as Odo of Saint-Amand, the Grand Master at the time, the Templars began to invest even more in the construction of new defensive positions and in reprisal expeditions against Muslim caravans and detachments. The tension between the two worlds, Christian and Islamic, reached a new level of violence and radicalization. From a symbolic point of view, the Siege of Le Chastellet represented the collapse of an idea that building walls was enough to contain the Muslim advance. The episode proved that the war in the Holy Land required more than military engineering. It was a war of intelligence, politics, and above all, faith. Baldwin began to interpret the signs of the times with greater sobriety. He understood that the survival of the kingdom depended on well-crafted alliances and prudent tactical decisions. Therefore, in the following years, even though he continued to fight Saladin on several fronts, the king showed a growing tendency toward balance and diplomacy, even negotiating temporary truces when necessary. However, the trauma of Le Chastellet would never fade from his memory. The massacre of the defenders, the sight of the ruined fortress, the accounts of survivors, all of this would remain engraved like a wound on his soul, already tormented by leprosy. Many claim that after this event, Baldwin became more introspective, more serious, almost prophetic in his view of the kingdom's destiny. Some chroniclers claim that Baldwin once said before the court, "We are not the owners of this land. We are only its sentinels for a brief time. And the winds that surround us are too strong for any wall." These words, if authentic, reveal a king who, even in his youth, understood the ephemerality of human power in the face of the march of history and divine will. The Siege of Le Chastellet was not just a military defeat. It was a transformative experience for the king and his people. It revealed the ferocity of the enemy, the limits of brute force, and the need for adaptation. It marked the beginning of a new phase of Baldwin's reign, one that was more strategic, more political, and also more solitary. The young leprous king emerged from that episode not broken, but hardened like steel, determined to continue fighting as long as his body and faith would allow. The Siege of Le Chastellet was more than the destruction of a fortress. It was the fall of an illusion that it would be enough to build walls to contain the Islamic tide that was forming under Saladin. For Baldwin, it was a bitter lesson about the limitations of power and the price of ambition. Still, this episode did not diminish him. On the contrary, it strengthened him. Even wounded in body and pride, the leper king remained at the helm of the kingdom, reformulating strategies, gathering allies, and keeping the flame of Christianity alive in the Holy Land. The figure of Baldwin teaches us about courage in dark times, about leadership even in the face of pain, and about how a determined spirit can resist even when everything around it seems to be falling apart. His youth, consumed by leprosy, never prevented him from fighting like a warrior and ruling like a statesman. If you were moved by this story of bravery, tragedy, and faith, don't forget to leave your like, comment on your impressions of the Le Chastellet episode, and subscribe to the channel to follow other chapters in the impressive life of Baldwin, the Leper King of Jerusalem. See you next time.